My son called me slow, useless, stinking trash, after I sold my only home to fund his grand business. Then he left me homeless. He thought this old woman was finished and forgotten. He didn't expect one tenacious reporter to make my truth viral, his empire to turn to dust, and the world's kindness to give me a new beginning. Before I begin my story, let me know in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is. I just want to know I'm not alone in this. And if you feel moved by what you hear, consider subscribing. It helps more people become aware of the reality of elder abuse. Now let me tell you what really happened. My name is Patricia Coleman, though most folks who've known me through my 69 years just call me Patty. My life, for the longest time, was a simple tapestry woven with the threads of quiet joys and the enduring love for my late husband, Arthur, and our only child, Kevin. Arthur was a good man, a steady provider, but a heart condition took him from me too soon, nearly 15 years ago now, leaving me with a house full of memories and a son who at 26 then was just finding his feet in the world. Kevin became my everything, the sole focus of my hopes and dreams. This old house on Maple Avenue wasn't grand, but Arthur and I had poured our hearts into it. Every rosebush in the small garden was planted by his hand, every slightly crooked picture frame held a story. It was paid off, a testament to our careful saving, and it was meant to be my sanctuary, my security in my twilight years. I lived a modest life on my widow's pension and the little Arthur had left, content with my books, my small circle of church friends, and the weekly phone calls from Kevin as he navigated his early career. Kevin was always ambitious, my boy. Even as a child, he dreamed big, his eyes fixed on a horizon far beyond our quiet, working-class neighborhood. He was smart, charismatic when he wanted to be, and I, like any mother, saw in him a boundless potential. Perhaps I indulged him too much after Arthur passed, trying to fill the void his father left, trying to give him every advantage I could. So when Kevin, now a man of 41 with a sharp suit and an even sharper glint in his eye, came to me 6 months ago with his once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, my heart swelled with a familiar pride. He'd been working for a series of tech companies, always restless, always talking about his vision. Now he had it. A startup. A revolutionary app. He called it something to do with synergizing lifestyle management through curated AI experiences. The jargon mostly went over my head, but the passion in his voice, the conviction in his eyes, that I understood. He painted a dazzling picture of success, of building an empire, as he put it, one that would not only make him a name but would also secure a comfortable, even luxurious future for both of us. "This is it, Mom," he'd said, his hands gripping mine, his gaze intense. "This is the one. But I need seed money. Serious seed money. The investors are interested, but they want to see significant founder commitment." I knew what that meant. My small savings were negligible in the face of the figures he was talking about. There was only one asset I possessed that could provide the kind of capital he needed. My home. The house on Maple Avenue. Arthur's roses. My sanctuary. The thought was a physical blow, a cold fist clenching around my heart. So my home. The place where every corner whispered of Arthur, where Kevin himself had taken his first steps. "Kevin dear," I'd said, my voice trembling slightly, "the house, it's all I have. It's our family history." He'd looked at me then, his expression shifting from excited visionary to something I couldn't quite name, something that made me uneasy. "Mom, it's just bricks and mortar," he said, a hint of impatience creeping into his tone. "Memories are in your heart, not in wallpaper. Think of it as an investment. The returns will be incredible. You'll have a beautiful new apartment, a penthouse maybe. No more worrying about leaky roofs or property taxes. I'll take care of everything. You'll be a queen, Mom." A queen. The word felt alien. I just wanted to be a mother, secure in her small corner of the world. But he was so persuasive, so full of conviction. He showed me glossy presentations, spoke of valuations, of market shares, of a future so bright it almost blinded me. He painted a picture of us together, sharing in his triumph, my sacrifice the bedrock of his success. And what mother doesn't want to believe in her child's dream, especially when that child is all she has left? Perhaps it was my loneliness, my own quiet fear of a future spent counting pennies, or perhaps it was just the enduring, sometimes foolish, boundlessness of a mother's love. After weeks of his relentless persuasion, of him painting visions of a shared, prosperous future, I agreed. With a heart heavy with a grief almost as profound as when I lost Arthur, I signed the papers. My beloved home, my anchor, was sold. The proceeds, a substantial sum that represented a lifetime of careful living, were transferred directly into Kevin's new business account. He was ecstatic, full of grand promises. "You won't regret this, Mom. We're going to be rich. You'll see." He arranged for me to move into a small, furnished apartment he'd found, just temporarily, he assured me, until the first big profits roll in, then we'll get you that penthouse. The apartment was clean but sterile, devoid of the warmth and memories of Maple Avenue. But I told myself it was a small price to pay for Kevin's happiness, for his future. I poured all my love and trust into his venture, into him. I, Patricia Coleman, who had always been so cautious, so grounded, had bet everything on my son's dream. In those first few months, Kevin was attentive, calling frequently with exciting updates about his empire. He'd talk about new hires, potential partnerships, the buzz he was creating. He was living the high life, attending fancy events, his social media filled with pictures of him alongside people whose names I vaguely recognized from business magazines. I was proud, of course, but a small, nagging unease began to surface. He never seemed to have time for a quiet dinner with me anymore, his visits to my little apartment becoming shorter, more perfunctory. When I'd ask about when I might see some return on my investment, or when we might look for that penthouse, he'd become vague, dismissive. "Soon, Mom, soon. These things take time. Don't worry your old head about the details." My old head. The phrase, tossed off casually, stung. I wasn't that old, not really. And my head, the one that had managed budgets and raised a child alone, was perfectly capable of understanding details. But I said nothing, not wanting to be the worrying mother cramping his style. I trusted him. I had to. I had given him everything. The transition from my beloved home on Maple Avenue to the sterile, anonymous apartment Kevin had found for me was jarring, but I'd clung to his promises like a drowning woman to a raft. "Just temporary, Mom," he chirped, his eyes shining with the fever of his new venture. "Once the app launches big, once the series of funding comes through, we'll get you that penthouse overlooking the park. You'll see." I wanted to believe him. Oh, how I wanted to believe him. My entire life savings, the very roof over my head, was invested in that belief. Kevin's empire, as he grandly called his app company, did seem to take off with a bewildering speed, at least on the surface. His social media, which he'd once encouraged me to follow, "See, Mom? This is the future," became a dizzying parade of launch parties in sleek, minimalist venues, photos of him shaking hands with sharp-suited men who looked like they lunched on stock options, and breathless articles in online tech blogs heralding him as the new wunderkind of the lifestyle management sphere. He moved into a stunning loft apartment downtown, all gleaming chrome and panoramic city views, the kind of place I'd only ever seen in glossy magazines. He bought a sports car that cost more than my old house had been worth in its entirety. My own circumstances, however, did not reflect this meteoric rise. The temporary apartment remained my reality. My weekly calls with Kevin, once filled with his excited chatter about disrupting the market, became shorter, more strained. He was always in a meeting, or jetting off to a conference, or networking with VCs. When I gently inquire about the business, about my investment, or even about that promised penthouse, his voice would take on a familiar edge of impatience. "Mom, these things are incredibly complex," he'd say, the condescension barely veiled. "You wouldn't understand the burn rate, the scaling challenges. Just trust me. It's all going according to plan." But the plan, it seemed, increasingly did not include me. My small, furnished apartment began to feel less like a temporary stopover and more like a holding cell. The highlight of my week was often a trip to the local library, a pale imitation of the rich intellectual life I'd shared with Arthur in our book-filled home. Kevin's visits dwindled to hurried drop-ins, usually when he needed me to sign some document he'd vaguely explain as routine business paperwork, or when he wanted to impress upon me, yet again, how incredibly busy and important he had become. Then came the day he told me he needed my apartment. "Some very important investors are flying in from Singapore, Mom," he announced, not even sitting down, his eyes already on his expensive watch. "My place is a bit of a bachelor pad, you know? Not quite right for hosting them for a week. Yours is quieter, more discreet for these initial talks." "But Kevin," I began, "where will I go?" He waved a dismissive hand. "Oh, I found a perfectly adequate little studio for you across town. Just for a week or two while these negotiations are ongoing. It's all arranged." The perfectly adequate little studio was a dingy, cramped room in a rundown building, smelling faintly of mildew and despair. The single window looked out onto a brick wall. There was no pretense of this being temporary for my benefit. This was me being moved out of the way, an inconvenient piece of old furniture. It was there, in that depressing little room, that Kevin delivered his next set of pronouncements. He'd come by ostensibly to check on me, but his real purpose soon became clear. He looked around the squalid space with an expression of distaste. Then his gaze settled on me, my simple house dress, my worn slippers. "Mom," he said, his voice devoid of any warmth, "we need to talk. This whole situation, it's not working for my image." I stared at him, my heart sinking. "Your image, Kevin?" "Yes," he said, pacing the small room. "I'm building an empire. I'm meeting with billionaires, with influencers. And frankly, Mom, you don't quite fit anymore. You're a bit, well, you're slow. You ask too many questions. And honestly," he paused, then delivered the blow with chilling casualness, "sometimes, if I'm being brutally honest, you kind of stink. Like old things. Old houses. It's not the vibe I'm projecting. Stink? So useless?" The words, so casually cruel, so utterly dismissive of everything I had done for him, struck me dumb. I felt a hot flush of shame, then a cold wave of despair. "I'm far too busy building this company to be worrying about your care, Mom," he continued, clearly misinterpreting my stunned silence as agreement. You're a distraction I can't afford right now. You're a good woman, but you're from a different era. You're not part of this new world I'm creating." He told me then that he'd found a more permanent solution. A room in a boarding house, even further out, even smaller, even cheaper. He'd pay the first month's rent, he said magnanimously, but after that I'd need to manage on my widow's pension alone. The vast sums from the sale of my house, the money that was supposed to secure our future, was now entirely his, fueling his empire. An empire in which his own mother was deemed too slow, too smelly, too useless to even be a peripheral part. The move to the boarding house was a blur of humiliation. Kevin didn't help, of course. He sent a brusque moving service that handled my few remaining possessions with careless disdain. The room was tiny, with a shared bathroom down a dark, echoing hall. The promised first month's rent from Kevin never materialized. My calls to him went unanswered. My texts were ignored. Within weeks, the landlord of the boarding house, a hard-faced woman with no time for sob stories, was knocking on my door, demanding the overdue rent. I had nothing. My pension barely covered food. Kevin, my son, the boy I had sold my beloved home for, had ditched me, leaving me homeless, penniless, and utterly alone, with his cruel words about my stink and my uselessness as my only companions. The gilded cage of his initial promises had become a gutter of despair. And as I faced eviction onto the cold city streets, the full, horrifying extent of his betrayal finally, crushingly landed. My sacrifice hadn't just been unappreciated. It had been callously, ruthlessly exploited, and I had been discarded like yesterday's trash. The eviction notice from Mrs. Henderson, the hard-faced landlord of the boarding house, felt like the final, brutal punctuation mark on my son Kevin's betrayal. My widow's pension, already stretched thin, couldn't cover the rent he'd promised to pay and then conveniently forgotten. My calls to him, my increasingly desperate texts, had vanished into a void of silence. He had his empire, built with the proceeds of my beloved home on Maple Avenue, and I, his mother, was now officially homeless, a 69-year-old woman with a small, battered suitcase containing the last remnants of her respectable life. The descent into the city's underbelly was swift and terrifying. The first few nights, I huddled in bus shelters, my old coat pulled tight against the biting wind, jumping at every shadow, every unfamiliar sound. The shame was a constant, burning companion, hotter than the hunger pangs that gnawed at my stomach. Me, Patricia Coleman, a woman who had always paid her bills, kept a clean house, raised a son with love and sacrifice, now a vagrant, invisible to the bustling city around me. Eventually, a kind outreach worker, her eyes full of a pity I found almost unbearable, directed me to St. Jude's Shelter for Women. Walking through those doors into the noisy, crowded dormitory filled with the lost and the broken, was the lowest point of my life. The air smelled of disinfectant and despair. I was assigned a narrow cot, a thin blanket my only comfort against the institutional chill. My fellow residents were a mixed bag, some young, their eyes hard with a premature world weariness, others older like me, their faces etched with stories of loss and betrayal I could only imagine. Days at St. Jude's blurred into a monotonous routine of queuing for meals, trying to find a quiet corner to read a tattered paperback, and endless, soul-crushing hours spent staring at the peeling paint on the walls, replaying Kevin's cruel words. "You stink, slow, useless. I'm far too busy building this company to be worrying about your care, Mom." His voice, once the sweetest sound in my world, now echoed in my mind like a tormentor's taunt. How had my loving boy become this monster? How had my ultimate sacrifice for his dream led to my utter destitution? It was during my second week at the shelter, as I sat listlessly in the common room, trying to ignore the blare of a daytime talk show on the communal television, that I first noticed her. A young woman, perhaps in her late 20s, with intelligent, observant eyes and a notebook clutched in her hand. She wasn't one of the residents. She had the focused, slightly detached air of a professional. She was speaking quietly to some of the other women, her head bent, listening intently. A reporter, I surmised, or perhaps a social worker gathering case studies. I tried to make myself invisible, to shrink into the worn armchair, not wanting my shame to be dissected, to become another statistic in someone's article on urban poverty. But she had a way about her, a quiet empathy that seemed to draw people out. I saw one of the younger women, usually so guarded and defensive, actually smile as she spoke to her. Later, I saw the reporter sitting with Mrs. Henderson, a woman in her 80s who had lost her apartment after a medical crisis, her gentle face animated as she recounted her story. The next day, the reporter, whose name I learned was Sarah Chin, approached me. I was sitting by the window, humming an old lullaby Arthur used to love, a habit I'd fallen into when the despair threatened to overwhelm me. It was a tune my own mother used to sing to me, a fragile thread connecting me to a happier past. "Excuse me," Sarah said softly, her voice kind. "I couldn't help but notice you. My name is Sarah Chin. I'm a journalist with the City Chronicle. I'm working on a series about the hidden faces of homelessness in our city, particularly among seniors." I stiffened, my first instinct to retreat, to deny. I don't have anything to say," I mumbled, looking away. Sarah didn't push. She simply pulled up a nearby plastic chair. "That's perfectly all right, Mrs. Coleman," I supplied reluctantly. "Patricia Coleman." "Mrs. Coleman," she said, her gaze direct but not intrusive. "I understand this is a difficult place to be, a difficult story to tell. But sometimes sharing these stories can bring about change, or at least understanding. The lullaby you were humming, it was beautiful. Did your mother sing it to you?" Her unexpected question, so personal, so gentle, caught me off guard. A lump formed in my throat. "Yes," I whispered. "And I used to sing it to my son." "Your son," she echoed softly. "Is he part of why you're here, Mrs. Coleman?" And then it all came pouring out. Not in a coherent narrative at first, but in a torrent of grief, anger, and bewildered pain. I told her about Arthur, about our home on Maple Avenue, about my dreams for Kevin. I told her about selling my house, every penny poured into his empire. I told her about the temporary apartment, then the squalid studio, and finally his cruel, dismissive words. "You stink, you're slow, useless, I'm too busy." I recounted the humiliation of the boarding house, the unpaid rent, the eviction, the terrifying nights spent on the streets before I found my way to St. Jude's. I showed her the faded photograph of my home I still carried in my worn wallet, the only tangible link to the life he had stolen from me. Sarah listened with an unwavering, compassionate attention that I hadn't experienced from anyone in what felt like an eternity. She didn't interrupt, didn't judge. She just listened, her pen occasionally flying across her notepad, her eyes reflecting a growing indignation on my behalf. When I finally finished, my voice hoarse, my cheeks wet with tears I hadn't even realized I was shedding, she was silent for a long moment. "Mrs. Coleman, Patty," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "That is one of the most heartbreaking stories of betrayal I have ever heard. Your son, Kevin Coleman, founder of Elysian Life Solutions." She'd clearly done some preliminary research on successful local startups. I nodded numbly. Elysian Life Solutions. The irony of the name, his lifestyle management app, was a bitter pill. He was managing lifestyles, all right, managing mine right into a homeless shelter. "Patty," Sarah said, leaning forward, her eyes blazing with a sudden, fierce energy. This isn't just a story about hidden poverty. This is a story about profound injustice, about potential financial elder abuse, about a son who has built his success on the ruin of his own mother. With your permission, I would like to investigate this further. I want to tell you truth. Not just as a statistic, but as Patricia Coleman, a woman who deserves dignity, respect, and justice. Her words, her belief in my story, in me, was like a spark in the suffocating darkness. Justice? Dignity? Could such things still be possible for me? A tiny, fragile seed of hope, one I thought had died on the cold city streets, began to unfurl within me. Perhaps my story wasn't over. Perhaps with this determined young reporter by my side, a new, unexpected chapter was about to begin. Sarah Chin, the young reporter from the City Chronicle, became a whirlwind of quiet, focused energy in the days that followed our first conversation at St. Jude's shelter. Her belief in my story, her palpable indignation at Kevin's cruelty, was like a balm to my bruised spirit. For the first time since I'd sold my home on Maple Avenue, I didn't feel entirely alone, entirely invisible. Sarah wasn't just after a sensational headline. She seemed genuinely invested in seeing some measure of justice done, or at the very least in ensuring my truth was heard. She visited me several times at the shelter, her notebook always at the ready, her questions gentle but probing. We sat in the noisy common room, or sometimes, when the weather was kind, on a worn bench in the shelter's small concrete yard. I recounted everything, starting from Kevin's ambitious dreams for his Elysian Life Solutions, my decision to sell my beloved home, the initial promises of a shared, prosperous future, and then the slow, chilling descent into his neglect and ultimate abandonment. I described the sterile temporary apartment, then the squalid studio, and finally his vile, dismissive words, "You stink, slow, useless, I'm too busy," that had preceded my eviction and homelessness. The faded photograph of my house, with Arthur's roses blooming proudly in the front garden, became a poignant exhibit in my tale of woe. Sarah was meticulous. She asked for dates, for any scraps of correspondence I might have kept, which were few as Kevin preferred verbal pronouncements to written commitments, for the names of anyone who might have witnessed his changing attitude or my declining circumstances before I ended up at St. Jude's. She even, with my hesitant permission, spoke to a couple of the other women at the shelter who had seen my initial despair. "Patty," she said one afternoon, her brow furrowed in concentration, "Kevin's company, Elysian Life Solutions, it's been getting a lot of positive press lately. He's being touted as a local success story, a visionary entrepreneur. He even gave a big speech at the mayor's business leaders luncheon last month, talking about ethical innovation and community upliftment." The irony was so bitter it almost choked me. My son, preaching ethics while his own mother, who funded his vision, was sleeping on a cot in a homeless shelter. Sarah explained her plan. She would write an in-depth feature article. It wouldn't just be my story, she would try to discreetly verify what she could. The sale of my house, the timeline of Kevin's company launch, his current lavish lifestyle which he so proudly flaunted on his company's social media. She would contrast that with my current reality. She promised to handle it with sensitivity, to protect my privacy as much as possible while still ensuring the core truth of my betrayal was undeniable. The day the article was scheduled to appear in the Sunday edition of the City Chronicle, I was a wreck of nerves. Sarah had brought me an early copy to the shelter. The headline was stark, powerful. "The empire built on a mother's ruin. Elysian Life Solutions founder accused of abandoning destitute mother after she funded his dream." Beneath it, a carefully chosen, dignified photograph of me from happier times, taken from an old album I'd managed to keep, juxtaposed with a small, discreet photo of the entrance to St. Jude's. The article itself was a masterpiece of investigative journalism and human empathy. Sarah had woven my story with facts about Kevin's company, quotes from anonymous former employees who hinted at his arrogance, and general statistics about the vulnerability of seniors to financial exploitation, even by their own families. She didn't sensationalize my pain, but presented it with a quiet, devastating clarity. She included his cruel words, "You stink, slow, useless," words that now in print looked even more monstrous. The reaction was immediate and explosive. By mid-morning, the online version of the article was trending citywide, then regionally. The comment sections were a raging inferno of disbelief, disgust, and overwhelming sympathy for me, Patricia Coleman. My name, which I had feared would forever be associated with shame and homelessness, was suddenly being spoken with respect and compassion. Kevin's name, however, was being dragged through the digital mud. Hashtags like #JusticeForPatty and #Kevin'sCruelty began to trend. People shared their own stories of elderly parents being mistreated. Local talk radio picked it up. Other news outlets began to call the City Chronicle, wanting to follow up. The story of the successful young entrepreneur who had allegedly built his empire by callously discarding the mother who gave him everything was a narrative that resonated deeply, tapping into a primal sense of outrage. Kevin's carefully curated image of a brilliant, ethical innovator shattered overnight. Elysian Life Solutions social media pages were flooded with furious comments. Calls for boycotts of his app began. His investors, his important friends, the ones for whom he deemed me too slow and useless, were suddenly seeing his name associated with elder abuse and profound ingratitude. At St. Jude's, the other residents and the staff treated me with a new level of kindness and respect. I was no longer just another forgotten old woman. I was Patty Coleman, the mother whose story had shocked the city. It was overwhelming, a strange mixture of vindication and a renewed wave of sorrow that my family's private pain had become such a public spectacle. Sarah visited me that evening, her own face a mixture of professional satisfaction and genuine concern for my well-being. "The city is outraged on your behalf, Patty," she said softly. "Kevin Coleman is facing a public relations nightmare of his own making. His empire is already showing cracks." She then told me something that made my heart leap with a hope I hadn't dared to feel. "And Patty," she continued, her eyes shining, "people want to help you. Really help. A local community group, moved by your story in the Chronicle, has already started a crowdfunding page. They want to raise enough money to get you out of here, to find you a safe, decent place to live. And a pro bono legal aid society specializing in elder law has reached out. They believe you have a strong case for financial restitution against Kevin. They want to meet with you. A crowdfunding page. Lawyers. For me. The tears that came then were not of shame or despair, but of a fragile, overwhelming gratitude. My truth, unleashed by a brave reporter, was not just being heard. It was igniting a response, a wave of compassion and a demand for justice that was far more powerful than I could have ever imagined. Perhaps my story wasn't just about my ruin, but about the beginning of my reclamation. The days following Sarah Chen's explosive article in the City Chronicle, and her subsequent visit to St. Jude's shelter where she told me about the crowdfunding and the legal aid offer, felt like living in the eye of a bewildering, yet strangely empowering, storm. My small, insignificant life, once defined by Kevin's cruelty and my own quiet despair, had suddenly become a public touchstone for outrage and compassion. The staff at the shelter, who had always been kind, now treated me with a sort of gentle reverence. Even some of the other residents, women whose own stories of hardship were etched deeply into their faces, would offer me a shy smile or a quiet word of encouragement. "You go, Patty," one of them, a young woman named Maria whose eyes held a wisdom far beyond her years, whispered to me. "You show em what happens when they mess with a mother." Sarah Chen kept me updated. Kevin's empire, Elysian Life Solutions, was indeed crumbling with astonishing speed. The viral hashtags #JusticeForPatty and #Kevin'sCruelty had taken on a life of their own. His company's social media pages were a wasteland of furious comments, one-star reviews and declarations of boycotts. Influential tech bloggers who had once lauded his vision were now penning scathing critiques of his character, questioning the ethics of a man who could build his success on his own mother's ruin. "His investors are panicking, Patty," Sarah told me during one of her visits, her voice a mixture of professional detachment and personal satisfaction. "The ones who were still on the fence after the initial rumors? Your verified story in the Chronicle was the nail in the coffin. Several major backers have publicly withdrawn their funding, citing ethical concerns and reputational risk. His Series B funding round he was so desperate for? It's dead in the water." Kevin himself had apparently gone to ground. His once boastful social media presence was scrubbed clean. His office lines went unanswered. Rumor had it he was holed up in his ridiculously expensive loft apartment, the one my house had paid for, likely trying to weather the storm, or perhaps desperately trying to find a PR firm willing to touch his now toxic brand. There was a certain grim satisfaction in picturing him, the self-proclaimed visionary, now a pariah, his empire built on sand and deceit washing away in a tide of public condemnation. He had called me slow and useless. Now it was his carefully constructed world that was proving to be utterly unsustainable. Meanwhile, the community's response to my plight was nothing short of miraculous. The crowdfunding page started by a local women's advocacy group had exploded. Donations poured in, small amounts from ordinary people who had been touched by my story, larger sums from local businesses horrified by Kevin's actions. People left messages of support, sharing their own experiences with ungrateful children or difficult times, creating a virtual blanket of warmth and solidarity that brought tears to my eyes. It was overwhelming to realize that so many strangers cared, that my quiet suffering had resonated so deeply. The Pro Bono Legal Aid Society Sarah had connected me with was a godsend. A sharp, compassionate lawyer named Ms. Ramirez listened to my full story, reviewed the details of my house sale, the transfer of funds to Kevin's company, and his subsequent abandonment of me. "Mrs. Coleman," she said, her eyes kind but her voice firm, "what your son did isn't just morally reprehensible, it's actionable. We have a very strong case for financial elder abuse, fraudulent misrepresentation, and potentially undue influence. We will fight to recover what he took from you." For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I felt a flicker of real power, not the cold fury that had sustained me, but the empowering sense of having advocates, of having a path to tangible justice. The crowdfunding meant I wouldn't be a burden on them. I could contribute to any out-of-pocket legal costs, though Ms. Ramirez assured me their primary goal was to help me regardless. The most immediate impact of the community's generosity was a way out of St. Jude's. The advocacy group, using the initial crowdfunding proceeds, found me a small, clean, furnished apartment in a quiet, respectable neighborhood, not far from a lovely park. It wasn't Maple Avenue, it wasn't filled with Arthur's roses or Henry's books, but it was safe. It was mine at least for now. The day I moved out of the shelter holding a bouquet of flowers given to me by the other residents, was a day of profound, tearful gratitude. I had a door I could close, a window that looked out onto trees instead of a brick wall, a small kitchen where I could make myself a proper cup of tea. It felt like a palace. Kevin's empire continued its spectacular implosion. His app, Elysian Life Solutions, was hemorrhaging users. His few remaining employees were reportedly jumping ship. The important friends he had been so keen to impress by calling me slow and useless, now wouldn't be seen in the same zip code as him. His name became synonymous with filial ingratitude and corporate deceit. The City Chronicle ran follow-up pieces, detailing the community's efforts to support me, further contrasting his downfall with the quiet dignity I tried to maintain. I didn't revel in his destruction. There was no joy in seeing my son, the boy I had raised, become a public disgrace. Each news report, each sympathetic glance from a stranger who recognized me from the newspaper photo, was a fresh reminder of the deep, irreparable wound he had inflicted on our family, on me. But there was a growing sense of rightness, of a terrible imbalance being, however painfully, corrected. My focus now, with the support of Ms. Ramirez and the funds so generously provided, was on the legal battle ahead. Kevin, I knew, would not give up easily what he considered his. But he was no longer facing a slow, useless, stinking old woman he could easily discard. He was facing Patricia Coleman, a mother whose truth had rallied a city, a woman armed with skilled legal counsel and the quiet, unshakable power of a just cause. His empire had crumbled because its foundations were rotten. Now it was time to see if I could reclaim some of the good earth he had stolen from beneath my feet. The legal battle against my son Kevin was not a swift affair. Ms. Ramirez, my sharp and compassionate lawyer, had warned me that such cases, especially those involving financial elder abuse and fraudulent misrepresentation, could be protracted and emotionally draining. He was right. Kevin, despite his public disgrace and crumbling empire, was not about to relinquish his ill-gotten gains without a fight. He hired a slick, aggressive lawyer of his own, one who specialized in making victims feel like villains. There were depositions where I had to recount under oath the painful details of selling my beloved home on Maple Avenue, the transfer of my life savings to Kevin's company, Elysian Life Solutions, and his subsequent cruel abandonment of me. Kevin's lawyer tried to paint me as a forgetful old woman who had willingly gifted her son the money, then changed her mind out of spite, or as someone easily manipulated by Sarah Chin, the reporter, and Ms. Ramirez. But my memory, honed by years of academic discipline and sharpened by the sting of betrayal, was crystal clear. And Ms. Ramirez, with her calm precision, expertly dismantled their attempts to discredit me. The evidence we had gathered was formidable. The paper trail of my house sale, the direct transfer of funds into Kevin's business accounts, his lavish spending that far outstripped any legitimate early profits from his startup, and crucially the timing of his casting me aside once he believed he had secured all my assets. Sarah Chen's meticulously researched articles from the City Chronicle, though not direct legal evidence, had created a public narrative that Kevin's lawyer struggled to overcome. The community's outrage, the very public nature of his downfall, had made him a pariah, and it subtly permeated the atmosphere of the proceedings. Kevin himself was a shadow of his former arrogant self during the legal process. He looked harried, his expensive suits now seeming ill-fitting, his eyes holding a desperate, hunted look. His empire was indeed in ruins. Elysian Life Solutions had declared bankruptcy, its assets, if any were left after his plundering, likely to be seized by creditors. His influential friends had vanished. He was facing not just my civil suit, but also potential investigations by financial authorities due to the nature of his business dealings and the public accusations of fraud. The crowdfunding, so generously started by the community, continued to be a lifeline. It covered my modest living expenses in the small apartment the advocacy group had found for me, and it allowed me to contribute to the mounting legal fees without feeling like a complete burden on Ms. Ramirez's pro bono commitment. The letters and messages of support kept pouring in, strangers sharing their own stories, offering encouragement. It was a strange and humbling experience to have my private pain become a public cause, but it gave me strength. The turning point in the legal battle came during a mediation session. Kevin, faced with the undeniable evidence Ms. Ramirez had compiled, including forensic accounting reports that traced my money directly into his personal luxury expenditures and the failing shell of his company, finally seemed to realize the futility of his fight. His lawyer, perhaps seeing the writing on the wall and the potential for even more damaging public revelations if this went to a full trial, pushed him towards a settlement. It wasn't an easy negotiation. Kevin, even in his disgrace, still possessed a core of stubborn entitlement. He tried to bargain, to minimize his culpability, to paint himself as a victim of bad business luck rather than a perpetrator of deceit. But Ms. Ramirez was unyielding. "Your client, Mr. Coleman," she stated coolly across the mediation table, "took his mother's entire life savings, the proceeds from the sale of her beloved home, under false pretenses, then left her homeless and destitute while he lived a life of luxury. There is no bad luck here, only calculated cruelty and fraud. Mrs. Coleman is entitled to full restitution, and frankly significant damages for the emotional distress and hardship she has endured." After hours of tense back and forth, a settlement was reached. It wasn't everything I had lost. Kevin had squandered too much. His empire was a hollow shell. But it was substantial. Enough for me to reclaim a measure of security, enough to ensure I would never again be at the mercy of his whims or anyone else's. Crucially, the settlement included a clause where Kevin formally relinquished any future claim on any part of my estate, however small it might now be. The day the settlement was finalized, I didn't feel a surge of triumph, but a profound, weary relief. The legal fight was over. My focus now was on rebuilding my life. The crowdfunding had been so successful that, combined with the initial part of the settlement, there was enough for a down payment on a small, manageable house in a quiet neighborhood, not unlike my old Maple Avenue. It wouldn't be the same, it wouldn't hold Arthur's roses or Henry's books, but it would be mine. A true sanctuary. The question of my old home on Maple Avenue was a painful one. It had been sold to new owners during Kevin's initial business dealings, before I could legally intervene to stop that specific transaction. Reclaiming that specific house was impossible. But Ms. Ramirez, understanding its sentimental value, had fought hard to ensure the settlement reflected not just the monetary loss, but the loss of that irreplaceable home. So with the funds, I bought a small, charming cottage with a little garden. It wasn't Maple Avenue, but it was peaceful. Friends from the shelter, new acquaintances made through the advocacy groups, And even Sarah Chin, who had become a quiet source of support, helped me move in. The community, the strangers who had rallied around my story, had given me back more than just financial stability. They had given me back a sense of belonging, of being seen and valued. Kevin, I heard, was facing multiple lawsuits from disgruntled investors and creditors. His empire was a public joke, a cautionary tale of greed and filial impiety. He was professionally and socially ruined. I didn't seek out news of him, but it found its way to me nonetheless. There was no joy in it, only a deep, abiding sadness for the son I had loved and lost. My new home began to fill with new memories. I planted roses, different from Arthur's but beautiful in their own way. I started a small book club with some of the women from the shelter, who were also slowly rebuilding their lives. My health, though still bearing the scars of years of overwork and recent trauma, began to improve with the peace and security I now had. My story, the one that had started with such devastating betrayal, had found its resolution not in fiery revenge, but in the quiet, determined reclaiming of my life, my dignity, and my peace. The public had judged Kevin, and his empire had indeed crumbled. And I, Patricia Coleman, the mother he had called slow, useless, and stinking, was finally home, truly home, in a place built not on broken promises, but on the enduring strength of truth and the unexpected kindness